A mission rated low threat becomes a carefully engineered massacre, and one medic is the first to realize the battlefield has been built like a trap. Then the truth gets darker. The enemy leader is not driven by ideology, but by betrayal, buried records, and a past the system tried to erase. This hook pulls you into a military thriller where every shot, every order, and every silence points to a conspiracy larger than the battle itself.
The radio hissed. Then her voice cut the pandemonium, strangely serene for a valley ablaze. As fire poured from the ridgelines and the night came apart, she spoke to 480 men with a composure they were never taught. Alpha, push west 150 meters, she directed. Take the ravine. Go. Pinned, Commander Nate Harwick felt the battle turn in a way his 3 decades in the Corps couldn't process. 480 of the Navy's finest were caught in this kill box. The top brass promised a walk in the park, a standard op in mountains they'd known for 2 decades. That intelligence was garbage. The eastern attack was methodical, not a wild spray. Then the west erupted. The valley went from a safe zone to a tomb in under 2 minutes. Red tracers slashed the blackness. To his left, a man screamed. To his right, 2 fell silent, a quiet that was absolute. He keyed his mic. Doc, send your location. 5 seconds of static felt like a lifetime. Pinned, sir. Eyes north. Mortars are moving east. Evacuate your wounded. Her transmission interrupted before he could reply, her tone final. Move your casualties, Commander. I'm holding this position. Harwick stared at his radio. No one had ever seized his command net like that. It wasn't that she lacked fear, but that she commanded it a strength he'd seldom seen. He made the call, falling in line. Veterans would later struggle to describe that night. Their stories were the same. No voice on the radio had ever sounded like hers. It was an anchor. She clutched the handset, shoulder bleeding from a gunshot. Blood stained her uniform as a brutal chill took hold. But her focus was a knife's edge, her grip sure, and her voice never faltered. 477 men survived until dawn because of her. But that's the end of the story. This begins 18 hours earlier with a helicopter team flying into a trap. They were walking into it blind. The forward operating base was a pinprick at 6,000 feet, just 3 modular buildings and a satellite dish inside the wire. For the team, perimeter sweeps were just another part of the job. Sheer rock faces boxed them in. The biting, thin air was a hardship they had long since accepted. You accept what you can't alter. The chill was part of the landscape. At 1700 hours, the final chopper touched down, its blades kicking up dust. A crew chief heaved out gear as a single figure disembarked. The bird was airborne before her feet were set. The downwash slammed her, but she walked forward, undeterred. The base layout was familiar, committed to memory from a classified brief. But that brief contained something else, a detail she held close to the vest. That hidden intel was the real reason she was here. The rucksack on her shoulders and the case in her hand were both standard government issue. Dressed in gray BDU pants, she moved across the landing zone with a quiet efficiency. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs watched her, datapad in hand. He was a massive man, 6'2" and all muscle. He sized her up with the same detached calculation he applied to everything. He nudged his partner. That ruck probably weighs more than she does. The other Marine said nothing. She was small, maybe 5'4" and 120 pounds dripping wet. The gate sentry had double-checked her identification. Her gaze was constantly scanning, not just seeing, but analyzing her surroundings. Had Briggs bothered to notice, he would have seen the pattern. But he'd already formed his judgment. The manifest listed her as Tessa Cole, a contract medic. NavSpec Warcom had tapped her as a last-second replacement. Her file was perfect. Johns Hopkins Trauma Medicine Specialist. 2 tours, 53 field saves, and 0 losses. That final number had grabbed Commander Harwick's notice. A 53-0 record in combat zones wasn't just luck. 40 minutes later, he located her in the aid station. She was already organizing supplies based on the operational plan, her movements fluid and sure. She glanced up. Commander, you've seen the plan. I have. Your take? She tilted her head slightly. The casualty evacuation estimate is low. I'd bump it by 20%. He was speechless. It impacts our supply chain, she continued. This tent will be swamped. I require 3 alternate collection points. Harwick had anticipated the typical contractor excuse-making. He hadn't expected someone to question his casualty projections. Do it, he commanded. As he stepped back into the cold, he mentally tagged her. Asset or liability. Briggs vocalized his doubts 3 times before chow. At the gear shakedown, he complained her aid bag was too large. During the briefing, she was engrossed in the topo map. The 3rd instance was in the mess tent. He told 3 teammates she was a weak link, presenting it as an undeniable truth. In his world, that was a terminal diagnosis. Weak links were the reason good men came home in boxes. They were the X factor you neutralized before an op went hot. As far as he was concerned, he was doing his duty. He was unaware she heard every word through the thin wall. She just kept eating. Her father had taught her to hold her tongue until her words mattered. She had followed that rule for 16 years. At twilight, Chief Vance Dunar found her near the fence line. At 53, he possessed a quiet gravity the younger guys didn't. It was the stillness of a man who had seen too much to be rattled. He had been observing her, his look more analytical than judgmental. She was watching the valley succumb to darkness. He stood beside her, quiet for a full minute. Frank Cole was your father. She froze for 2 heartbeats. He was, she confirmed. Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia, and 3 rotations in Afghanistan. Retired in 2012. Her gaze finally met his. I was in Coronado with him in '95, Dunar said. I was 24 and thought I was bulletproof. Your dad disabused me of that notion. Frank dismantled my ego in under an hour, without ever yelling. He never spoke of me, she said flatly. Names weren't his style. That's Frank, Dunar conceded. But he mentioned you once, said his daughter had the eye. He called it the most uncommon talent he'd seen in 40 years, and that he was teaching you to trust it. She remained silent. He died in 2019. March 14th, a brain hemorrhage. 57. He made it through war zones just to die in a civilian hospital. She delivered the information with a surgeon's detachment, the pain of her loss blunted by time. Dunar gave a solemn nod. My condolences. Thank you. Night consumed the valley. The hum of the base generator kicked on. Your map study before, Dunar observed. You zeroed in on the high ground, the decisive terrain. That's pure Frank. Her silence was her only response. Listen, this isn't an interrogation, he added. Just an observation. I see the score. Whatever your real mission is, you've got solid guys here. The command element needed to be aware. Now I am. He turned and left. She remained at the wire. To get this, you have to understand Frank Cole. His name won't be in any history texts. His service record is a phantom. He avoided cameras his whole career. Among the teams, however, his story was the stuff of legend, passed down from one generation to the next. He signed up at 18. During Bud.S, he had a peculiar calm that baffled the instructors. He wasn't the top physical specimen, but when the pain peaked, he could detach and push on from a place Hell Week was designed to shatter. Very few men could manage that. He earned his trident, honed his craft, and never stopped adapting. He saw not just the tactics, but the overarching strategy. He was in Desert Storm, Somalia, and the Battle of Mogadishu. That firefight in October was a brutal education in how bad things can get. After 9/11, he served 3 tours in Afghanistan. His missions were so deep off the books that no Freedom of Information Act request will ever uncover them. His old squad knew him as Ghost, a name he'd earned. He separated in 2012, settling near San Diego. His life found a new cadence: morning PT, rifle maintenance, and teaching at a private range. He gave her a rifle for her 10th birthday, not to make her a mirror of him. At 10, she understood its heft, a truth known to children of warriors. It was a tool for a harder lesson, the physics of ballistics and the heart of the parse, choice to employ it. It was a lesson in force and its cost. He taught her on weekends and quiet summer dawns. She learned to gauge range, interpret the wind, control her breathing, and break a clean shot. She internalized ballistics and the patience of a hunter, learning the difference between a shot you can take and one you must. At 16, she hit 900 meters in a crosswind. His only critique, sloppy follow-through. She corrected it. That was the greatest praise he ever gave. Her admission to Johns Hopkins had his total support. He believed her hands were meant to heal, even after he taught them how to take a life. He respected the contradiction she embodied. In March 2018, he wrote a letter for her to find after his end. His heart was failing. The medical reports were final. He met his fate with cold logic, putting his final thoughts to paper. He died March 14, 2019, in a San Diego hospital, 57. She was a 21-year-old sophomore when the 0600 call broke everything. The entire structure of her world was gone. In the void, she started over. She went to class. One mission at a time, his way. 2 weeks later, she discovered the letter with his things. She read it once in her Denton bedroom, beneath a weak winter sun, then folded it. It was always with her. The memory returned as she moved to the BAS to rig her kit. She'd already stashed critical med supplies in 3 locations. An off-the-books task done solo at night, unseen. 4 hours pre-mission, she found Lance Corporal Reed Kowalski. At 23, he was a boot, coiled tight before his first firefight. His rifle was immaculate, its action clean. He looked like a poster boy, a perfect war machine on display. For 90 seconds she watched, catching the slow, unnatural blink rate everyone else ignored. Observation was her job. His hands were solid, but the cadence was wrong, a slight hesitation betraying an issue. A Marine called out, his head turned a split second slow, auditory processing lag. She moved in. Kowalski. He looked up, his face vacant. "Doc, don't move," she said, taking his pulse, checking his eyes. She shot 3 questions at him, timing the lag, not the words. "You've got heat stroke," she declared. "Began yesterday. High core, temp, thready pulse. You're grounded for 3 hours fluids and rack time." He started to protest. "Doc, I'm fine. Your cognitive speed is off by 12%, she interrupted, her tone flat. "Not enough for you to notice, but in a gunfight, that delay kills you or someone else. You're a risk. I can run this up the chain." He considered his choices, then met her gaze. "Roger that. I'm down." The IV was in his arm in 20 seconds. Harwick, the CO, observed from a distance. With the drip flowing, she reported, "He'll be fit to fight in 3. Light duty till 1400. Harwick nodded once and departed. Sergeant Briggs said nothing but drew nearer, his stare locked on her, his opinion of her clearly changing. The brief began at 1300. The tent was packed tight. Harwick conducted the brief with ruthless precision. No word was wasted. Tessa remained in the rear, unseen, her concentration total. The map showed the area of operations. Objective: a weapons stash in an enemy structure 8 kilometers away. Primary route through the valley, alternate along the north ridge. Staff Sergeant Alrek had overwatch. She was the only corpsman on the roster. 40 minutes passed. The talk turned to sniper hides. Harwick indicated 2 locations. Grid 477 exposes our guys to backblast, she stated, her eyes on her notes. The ledge at grid 479, 30 meters north, is clear with a good line of sight. The tent went quiet. Harwick's gaze shifted from map to medic. "Confirm. Topo map," she answered. He looked for 5 seconds. He changed the plan to her coordinates. Briggs was 2 meters away. She felt his stare without looking, the quiet reassessment of a man confronted with undeniable competence. She made a note and fell silent. The hours before a mission carry a distinct weight. On the FOB, all movement became deliberate. The noise faded as each Marine prepared in his own way. They stripped their rifles with a focus only combat provides. She ran a mental checklist of her medkit, then stopped. Her hand went to her chest, finding the sharp edges of the letter through her blouse. It had been there, over her heart, for 5 years. Her father understood a core truth. The critical moments in life arrive unannounced. They simply happen. So important words must be spoken early. He had given her what she would need. The text was part of her now, less a memory than the structure of her own mind. It was as integral as bone. Her hand stayed flat against her chest. Outside, as the sun dipped, the air grew teeth. At 2100, the helicopters lifted off, hugging the terrain. Tessa was in the second bird, the dark landscape rushing by the door. Her mind was a still point, a calm he'd taught her to build over years. The objective lay 3 clicks beyond the valley. Intel said, low risk. The drone feed was empty, a cakewalk. She understood the gap between the plan and the reality. The real threat is never the one you've prepared for. She kept her doubts to herself. Her job wasn't to question the plan, but to predict its failure points. They set down 2 clicks out. The helos vanished, leaving only dust and a deep, waiting silence. She fell into her spot in the center of the formation. Her stride was measured, saving strength for the fight. Vance Dunar was 3 men up on her left. A click later, he looked back, his eyes finding hers with perfect, combat-honed precision. Their eyes locked for a second, then he turned away. She went back to her scan of the ridgelines, reading the terrain as easily as a scholar reads a page. At 3.5 clicks, she saw it. A faint heat haze over the rocks on the east ridge, her 2 o'clock. A minor warp in the air, easy to ignore. 100 meters on, she saw it again, a signal in the static. Not a target, just data. She logged the detail without emotion. 3 clicks from the objective, the night came undone. The first rocket shrieked from the east ridge, the concussion wave a hammer blow to her chest. The shockwave hit your skeleton an instant before the sound. Before the blast faded, both ridges erupted in muzzle flashes. A perfect L-shaped ambush. Someone had talked. They had the route, the timetable, all of it. None of that mattered for the next minute and a half. Survival was the only mission. The squad broke for cover on instinct. Tessa was already moving. She ran for a rock outcropping she'd already mapped 12 meters off. She was there in 6 seconds, kit open. The first wounded man got to her 5 seconds later. Arm wound, shrapnel, packed and wrapped in 2 minutes. Kowalski was going into shock. A 4-second look told her why. Femoral artery, no pressure. TQ went on, high and tight. She packed the wound with combat gauze, using savage, necessary force. She talked while she worked, voice calm, giving him data, not comfort. A dying man needs facts. Tourniquet is on. It's gonna hurt. That's how you know it's working. Eyes on me. He obeyed. Good man. The third Marine was dragged to her. Deviated trachea, no breath sounds on one side, tension pneumo. He was drowning in his own chest. She found the 14 gauge, located the second intercostal space, and plunged it in. The rush of air was a life returning. She moved on. 2 machine guns had them pinned solid. The nests were dug in under a ledge, immune to direct fire. A tactical disaster. As she treated a 4th man, Harrelson was on the net. Get me a fix on those guns, now! Albright was hit, his rifle 20 meters away. Her brain split between medicine and tactics, tracking the enemy guns. After she stabilized the 4th Marine, her eyes found Dunar's. He was 17 meters out, his face confirming he saw the same problem and was waiting for her solution. Her trauma pack hit the dirt. She grabbed it, dropped it again. The heavy gun on the ridge hammered the ditch where 40 Marines were pinned. Each burst a tick of a clock counting down their lives. She slid the letter from an inner pocket, her fingers brushing the worn paper she'd carried for 5 years. For 3 seconds, she held it. His words settled in her soul. A truth she had always known, but only now accepted. She shoved the letter home, her eyes locking onto Dunar's. The M24, where? He was ready. Albright's rig. Left side, she was already moving. The weapon was right there. 16 years of training converged as her hands closed around it. This wasn't memory. This was instinct. Burned in by 10,000 repetitions until it became automatic. Like finding a doorknob in total darkness. She chambered around and thumbed the safety. Her fingers found the Schmidt and Bender 3x12 scope. Not the glass she would have chosen, but it would get the job done. Her mind was already running the numbers for the shot. Dunar shifted left without a word, a silent, tactical dance. He took up a position 12 meters away, covering the northern approach and reading the air currents. She began to climb before the choice felt conscious. The slope was a steep 35 degrees of loose shale, and the night was her only friend. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, each footfall silent and deliberate. The storm of incoming fire to her right was a pressure wave to move through, not to flee from. 3 rounds ricocheted off rock 15 meters from her position. She adjusted her path 4 meters and continued the ascent. Dunar's voice was a low buzz in her ear. Wind east-northeast, 12 knots. Temp 41. You have a 60-meter climb. The data was logged. 780 meters to the target. Her traverse gave her an angle of attack impossible for the men below. The rock overhang that protected the enemy nest was now useless. She had identified this weakness hours ago during the mission briefing. A rock ledge on the incline provided a perfect, stable firing platform. She went prone. The cold from the stone leached through her uniform, a sensation she registered and immediately dismissed. The bipod legs clicked open. The weapon became an extension of her own body. The optic brought the gunner's nest into sharp relief. 2 tangos, one on the gun, a spotter feeding the ammo belt and watching their 6. Professionals. They were dug into a natural rock formation, reinforced with sandbags, creating a kill box 780 meters away. She began to regulate her breathing. She saw a Texas field at dawn. Her father, when she was just 10, explaining that shooting wasn't about strength. It was physics and anatomy, and the discipline to turn your body into a precision machine for 1 perfect second. He told her, 5 years makes you good, but 20 makes you an artist, the difference between chance and certainty. He'd started her training early. The wind held steady from the east-northeast at 12 miles per hour. A 12-mile-per-hour crosswind would push the round 14 inches off target. She dialed in the correction. She accounted for bullet drop, air density, and even the planet's rotation, a small but critical detail at this range. She controlled her breath. Inhale 4 seconds, hold, exhale for 8. The practice cadence dropped her heart rate from a combat high to the low 60s, the sniper zone. It was ingrained muscle memory now. She settled her sight picture, shifting 2 inches to the right to lock in her firing position. An unstable platform ruins a shot. She centered the crosshairs. She could feel her own pulse in her ribs, her wrist, her neck. She found the quiet space between the beats, that quarter second of absolute stillness. That was the window. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar recoil. She rode it out and reacquired the target. The shot was wide, 8 inches to the right. The enemy gunner was already diving for cover, reacting to the sound of the shot. Down in the valley, she heard Briggs on the radio, his voice a mix of shock and accusation. But the miss was all that mattered. She reran the dope in her head. A sudden gust of wind she hadn't accounted for. She watched the heat mirage dance off the distant rocks, discerning its rhythm. A lull in the wind came every 8 seconds. She clicked the windage 4 times to the left, settled her breathing, slowed her heart rate, and waited for her moment. She waited for that 2-second calm. She set the reticle. She pressed the trigger. The heavy machine gun went silent. Dunar's voice came over the comms, flat and professional. Target down. Weapon is quiet. She was already on the move. The next nest was 140 meters south. At a different elevation, a new problem to solve. She slid 30 meters down a scree slope to get a clear line of sight. Rushing on a dark incline is a good way to get killed. She settled in, calculating a 920-meter shot across 2 shimmering heat ridges, reading the crosswind by the way it moved the grass. 1 press of the trigger, threat eliminated. It took 37 minutes and 6 different positions to secure the pass. She dismantled their defenses piece by piece, heavy guns first, then their crews, followed by 2 light machine guns covering the exfil route. She moved between firing positions like a ghost, executing a plan she had formulated before her first shot. She only took shots that were guaranteed hits. After that first miss, every single round found its mark. Below, the tide of the battle turned, with each silenced gun. Pinned down squads began to push forward. She could hear Harwick redirecting his teams into the lanes she was clearing. She was no longer thinking. The planning had been done at the bottom of the slope. A choice had been made. Now this was just the work that followed. The task required no further thought. It only required what her father had taught her: absolute focus and the steel will to push through the hard parts where other people quit. She never quit. When the last gun fell silent, she scanned the ridge for a full 90 seconds, checking every shadow. Certain, she keyed her mic. "Commander Harwick, both ridges are clear. Corridors are open. I recommend exfil via the main road." There was a pause. Then Harwick's voice came back, tight with disbelief. "Roger that, Doc. What's your 20? "North slope, 80 meters up, coming down now." A longer pause. "Descend with caution," he ordered. When she reached the valley floor, Dunar was there. Harwick stood 10 feet back, flanked by a silent group of Marines. She ignored their stares. She walked to her gear, stowed the rifle, and opened her trauma pack, kneeling by the first casualty. Who else is hit? A strange, quiet settled over the group, the kind that happens when you witness something that shatters your perception of reality. It wasn't confusion. Every man on the ground knew what had just happened. They'd watched the enemy guns go silent one by one. They saw her come off that ridge, put away the long gun, and go right back to patching up the wounded as if it were nothing. Just 37 minutes of impossible shooting. The silence that followed was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. Briggs stood frozen for 4 minutes. Then, he walked over to where she was working on Staff Sergeant Dow, a calf wound from a ricochet, and just watched her hands. He looked like a man doing difficult calculations about his own soul. Finally, he asked, "Where in the hell did you learn to do that?" She didn't look up from the bandage. "My father." "Who's your father?" She gave him a fleeting look. "Navy." Briggs glanced at Dunar, who stood there with the look of a man holding a royal flush. Harwick approached, his commanding officer's face, a mask that was struggling to contain the shock. It was barely holding. His eyes were fixed on her, his mind visibly redrawing every plan he had ever made. "Cole," he said. "Sir, when you're squared away..." 3 minutes, sir." He waited. She secured Dow's bandage, got to her feet, and faced him. He saw a completely different person standing before him. "Your father," Harwick stated, "not a question. Frank Cole, Master Chief, retired. SEAL Team 3, fought in Desert Storm, Somalia, 3 tours in Afghanistan." His eyes cut to Dunar. "Frank Cole," Dunar confirmed, and the name landed with the weight of a final judgment. Briggs was already moving, heading for the SATCOM. He was about to pull a service record that would take him all night to fully comprehend. The valley was silent, but it was not calm. It was the heavy quiet of an aftermath. She looked Harwick dead in the eye. "I have 4 more wounded to check before we can move out, sir." "Get on it," he ordered. An hour before sunrise, with the casualties stabilized, Harwick found her on the perimeter. Her back was against a boulder as she methodically repacked her aid bag with an operator's deep-seated muscle memory. He approached her slowly, not looking for a confrontation. She already knew what this was about. "Somalia," he said. Her hands paused for a fraction of a second. "October 3rd and 4th, 1993, my father spoke of it twice. Once when I was 14 and I pushed him. The second time at 20 when he was teaching me about combat stress." Her hands went back to her work. "The men who were really there don't talk about it." "No," Harwick agreed. "They don't." He glanced up at the dark ridge. "He trained you. 10 years old, 6 straight years of instruction. Weekends, summers, wind, dope, trigger squeeze, the cold science of it all." She snapped a pouch on her kit shut. "The training never really stopped. I outgrew the lessons around 19. After that, it was just maintenance. Then he was gone, and I made a promise to my mother." Her voice was flat, clinical. "She watched him leave for 30 years. She made me promise to bury that part of his life with him. Not all of it, just the part that wasn't about saving lives. I gave her my word. But tonight, the objective came first." Her eyes met his. "My father taught me that a promise is a structure. You build it for a reason. You build it to protect something. When that structure no longer serves its purpose, you have to choose your loyalty." Harwick studied her face. "He sounds like one hell of a man." "The best I ever knew," she replied, a simple statement of fact, devoid of emotion. He paused. "Chief Dunar called Frank Cole a ghost, the highest praise he gives." Dunar's stingy with words. He said the same about you. She didn't respond. Harwick got to his feet. I need a full AAR at the FOB. This isn't about the mission, he stated. This is on you. Your file on my desk, your abilities, intel I was missing. I command this unit. I know my Marines. That's policy. Dismissed. He turned to go. Sir, he stopped. Kowalski needs a surgeon inside 6 hours. My field dressing is solid, but we're on the clock. Medevac is en route. He looked at her one last time. Cole, get some shut-eye. She went back to her gear. Rest like that wasn't part of the loadout. She returned to her work. Work was tangible. The letter surfaced in her memory. She'd read it first at 21 in a sterile dorm room, the world oblivious to the weight of that paper. She discovered it among his belongings 2 weeks after they buried him, a lone envelope marked with her name. She opened it in her old bedroom, the new silence of the house crushing her. He led with logistics, always the tactician. Bank info, lawyer's contact, VA paperwork. It was his final operational plan, a blueprint for the aftermath. A small kindness amid the wreckage. Then came the words. Tessa, he wrote, I should be saying this to you in person, but I don't know how much time I have. The world rarely offers clean exits. I've learned, you say what needs to be said before the fight. In the thick of it, there's no room. You promised your mother, and I respect that. I know she asked because of me. Your mother holds a certain wisdom we can't grasp, earned from 30 years loving a man in this profession. But I have to say this. I trained you, not to be a mirror of me, but because you had to know. I was always honest about that. To truly know something, deep in your bones, is to control it. Ignorance makes you a target. Knowledge gives you options. I've trusted your judgment since you were 12. You have a rare talent for reading a situation and making the right decision. In 40 years of service, I saw that in maybe 5 other men. A time is coming when you'll have to pick between your promise and the correct action. I can't simulate that choice for you. I can only say that I trust you'll recognize the difference. No matter what you choose, you had my respect long before that moment arrives. He signed it, your father. Plain, unbreakable. She'd probably read it 100 times, had it memorized, but kept the original page. The paper felt real. The feel of it, the indentation from his pen, the knowledge that his hand had formed those words. She'd gripped it at the base of that ridge, just before taking up the rifle. Now, in the sharp air, Dawn was cementing last night's actions into facts. She had to confront that promise. She had broken it, utterly. In her mother's kitchen, she'd made a promise she intended to keep. Last night, she incinerated it. Both were now true. They had to coexist. Her father foresaw this day. He said the vow and the objective would collide, and she'd know it. She had. 60 operators witnessed that sunrise. Kowalski, at 23, was going home alive. The 40 men in the kill box, who were moments from being vaporized, were granted another day. She stowed that truth away, one more heavy piece of gear to hump, and she watched the light claim the valley. An hour past dawn, Briggs showed up. No small talk. He found a rock and just stared at the ridgeline. Frank Cole, he said at last. I pulled his jacket on the sat phone. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed. Long range, all clean shots. Somalia, 3 tours in the stand. 7 awards. 4 of them were redacted above my security clearance. He went quiet. A man's public record is a legend. I can only imagine the rest. She said nothing. I said something when you arrived, he went on. I recall. I'd take it back, but that's not an option. He finally met her eyes, squaring some internal account. I made a command call based on faulty intel. That's not how I keep my men alive. It's a lesson I should have already learned. You made a call with the available intelligence, she replied. That's the job. I did my job poorly, he shot back. Wrong process, bad result. The silence hung between them. Acknowledge it, she said. Then file it where it will do some good. That's what my father would do. He studied her. Was he the type of man to just leave it at that? He was the type to say it once, and you were expected to understand it. She paused. He'd spend hours picking apart last night's mistakes. then decide the outcome was satisfactory. Coming from him, that was high praise. Briggs thought about it, then stood up. His posture had shifted. Something had been set right. For the record, what you did on that ridge was textbook by any standard I know. He turned and left. She watched him walk away. The medevac lifted off at 0900. She kept pressure on 2 wounded, calling out their stats in the flat tone used for men injured beyond their own comprehension. Kowalski was awake for most of it. He watched her but kept his mouth shut, the smart move. The FOB appeared below as they descended to the landing zone. She moved directly from the helicopter to the aid station, starting the handoff, reciting every field treatment, and updating the base medics. She was precise. A sloppy turnover could kill a man who'd already survived a firefight. It took 2 solid hours. Harwick was waiting when she emerged from the tent. His expression was past surprise and had settled into a sharp need for answers. They sat on a pair of Pelican cases. "Walk me through it," he said. The unit's assigned doc, Lieutenant Marsh, went down with appendicitis 4 days back. The position was filled from the contractor list. I volunteered. Why? She knew that was coming. I saw the op brief. It specified a single sniper team. I reviewed Staff Sergeant Ulrich's file. Good man, solid record, but this terrain requires a second overwatch, bare minimum. The billet was for a medic. She met his stare. I can do both, so I filled it. Harwick studied her. You knew another skill set might be required before you even got on that bird. I knew it was a possibility, not a guarantee. You didn't disclose those skills. My official record is in my jacket. My time behind a scope is not. What my father taught me was off the books. It's not listed for an operational billet. SOCOM has no file on it. Her gaze was steady. If I had listed it, this would have played out differently. There are protocols to get another shooter. Those protocols take time. I had 4 days. The system would have sent a body to fill a slot, not an asset who already saw the mission's tactical weak point. He was silent. You came in aware of our weakness, he said, and you maneuvered yourself into position to cover it without a word. Yes. Why the secrecy? She thought for a moment. If I had arrived as a sniper with the medic's insignia, we'd be debating my credentials, which officially are non-existent. I would have spent my tour defending my place here instead of doing my job. She let the silence stretch. The job was more important than the debate. Harwick stood and paced 4 steps away, his back to her. He turned. My after-action report tonight will be factual, he said. Every single detail. That AAR goes up the chain, and I can't predict their reaction. You need to grasp that. I do. This could bring consequences down on you, sir. 3 Kia, 22 wounded, the mission failed. It's already a disaster. What you did gets reported, honestly, or it gets buried. And if it's buried, I'm the only one who walks away clean, and my career is not the objective. He met her gaze. File the truth, she said. He gave one curt nod and walked toward the command tent. She remained on the case, watching the glowing mountains. They seemed sharp and clear, like anything seen after a night with a high price. She put a hand to her chest. I broke my promise, and it was the right decision. He had to have known. I think I did too, deep down. She stood up to go finish her reports. The intelligence file on Owen Graff arrived at 1300 hours on the second day. Harwick read it twice, then called his team leaders. It was a short file. The critical ones usually are. Born in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1973, Graff enlisted at 18. He sailed through the pipeline for special operations, the kind that breaks almost everyone. He passed Delta selection. The agency's Special Activity Center recruited him in his early 30s. They handle the black ops in the shadows. The consensus was he was in the top 1%. His file described him as a tactical genius whose conscience had no off switch, unlike his peers. He could never just shut it down. The file noted this first as a strength and later a weakness. In 2012, he led a 4-man team into Syria on Operation Cardinal. They engaged the target, but during exfiltration, their position was compromised. They lit up the comms, desperate for backup. A support aircraft was launched. It was 40 minutes away when it was rerouted. The official report cited a weather system. 2 separate weather posts in the area reported clear conditions. 3 of his men died in the firefight that followed. Graf was taken prisoner. He survived 18 months in a place no one returns from. His escape was detailed in heavily blacked out documents. He had been officially declared killed in action in December of 2012, but he was alive. For 12 years, he has been plotting. The result of that plotting was now entrenched in the peaks around them, guided by a strategy forged from a decade of cold logic, not anger. He had one objective: to make people accountable for the decisions they made. Harwick shut the file. This has nothing to do with ideals, Harwick stated. He's not trying to burn the world down. His objective is precise: to expose some poor command choices and settle a score. He let the words hang. That doesn't make him right. It makes him more lethal than some zealot. A man on a mission is a smarter operator than one fueled by rage. A weighted silence filled the command tent. He'll make another push tonight, Harwick said. No one disagreed. A dozen years of planning wouldn't fold after one failed attempt. Tessa lingered at the edge of the group, listening. She'd already glimpsed the dossier over Harwick's shoulder, and he hadn't stopped her. A single read was enough. The intel landed like a gut punch, rewriting the entire tactical map. She saw him in Syria, 2012, learning that reinforcements were on the way moments before the radio went dead. That knife's edge between hope and the abrupt, final silence. She considered what's left of a soldier after 18 months in that kind of hell, how it incinerates any belief in the mission, the flag, or anything else. She considered the unique venom of being left for dead by your own, and how it slowly corrodes a man from the inside out. Pushing it aside, she returned to the battalion aid station. She spent the following 4 hours on prep. She restocked medical kits and repositioned supplies, wargaming the likely vectors for a second assault by an enemy who adapted from his mistakes. She reviewed the previous night's casualty reports. A field dressing was just a temporary fix. Afterwards, she forced herself to eat a full MRE. Her father's words echoed in her head. Chow and sleep are weapons, not luxuries. He was right, of course. She sacked out for a hard 90 minutes, falling into the profound, tactical rest of someone who could power down on command. She was back in the BAS, running a final check on her loadout when Dunar showed up at 1700 hours. He entered silently, their eyes locking. After what they had just been through, words were pointless. Tonight will be a different beast, he said. I know. Last night, you had cover of darkness. Now Graf has your number. His look was direct. He'll be gunning for you. She just nodded. You solid? She flexed her hands, noting a small blister rising on her trigger finger. Just another piece of intel on her own operational status. Good to go, she confirmed. A look then crossed his face, the kind a man gets after wrestling with a decision and landing on one. Your old man sent me an email, he said. January 2019, right before he died. She froze. He mentioned a project you were on, said he was proud. The man never used email. That's how I knew it was important, something he wanted documented. Dunar's focus shifted to the tent canvas. He said you were a consultant on a naval special warfare initiative, totally off-book and uncredited. He paused for effect. He outlined a system you created for unified combat medicine. He called it, and this is verbatim, the single greatest tactical leap in SOF operations in 20 years. Her eyes were fixed on a medical case. He said you worked without attribution so your rank wouldn't get in the way. Said it was the right call, that it was your style. She clicked the case shut. He knew. She breathed. A beat passed. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light. The wind battered the perimeter outside. I had my reasons for holding on to this, Dunar said. I knew you were squared away from day one, but I didn't have the full picture. I'd heard rumors Frank's kid was rewriting the book in training commands, but I didn't grasp the scope. Didn't know you were the voice. He met her eyes. Mentioning it sooner might have thrown you off your game. Frank knew you'd get the job done without needing an attaboy. I figured I should extend you the same respect. She held his gaze. He was always seeing the whole board while we were just looking at the next move, she said. Damn straight. You've known since I arrived, I suspected. You proved it when you tore apart our Overwatch strategy in the briefing. That entire methodology had his fingerprints on it, I was sure. He gave you the foundation, but what you built is all new. She remained quiet. For 3 years, she developed it in the shadows, squeezing it in between deployments. It was vital work. This wasn't some cookie-cutter TTP. It was a philosophy, a framework she hammered into shape to close the deadly space she discovered between command decisions and battlefield care. Her instruction came over ghost comms, no name, no rank, nothing to trace. The assaulters who graduated her course called her the mentor. The mission was all she cared about. Tonight, her voice was clipped, final. Tonight, he confirmed. He left her in the Tactical Operations Center's gloom, so she went to find Harwick. At 2200 hours, Graf's assault erupted. His team swarmed from the south, boiling out of storm drains that Intel had deemed impassable. The recon report was largely accurate, except for the part that could get you put in the ground. 200 hostiles swarmed from 4 synchronized access points on the southern line. They moved with the fluid discipline of a unit designed for a single purpose. This was no repeat performance. This was a fresh playbook from the same author, one that proved he had dissected his initial failure. For the first 4 minutes, the perimeter held. Harwick had anticipated a southern attack and had positioned his heavy weapons accordingly. The first wave was shredded in the concertina wire. A second wave crashed into them, followed immediately by a third. They struck from 3 sides at once, and the defensive line broke faster than any simulation had shown. It was the kind of catastrophic collapse that happens when your opponent is already 1 step ahead. The world flashed white while Tessa was in the aid station. 45 seconds later, she was sprinting for the eastern flank, staying low under the web of green tracers. A trauma bag in one hand, her M24 rifle on her back. The corpsman and the shooter were one and the same. Briggs's 12-man squad was defending the eastern sector. She got there and began triaging the wounded, focusing on the priority. Petty Officer Holloway, a through-and-through GSW to his thigh. As her hands worked, her mind analyzed the firefight. Enemy rounds were pouring in from a sniper-high 200 meters to the southeast, which gave them a perfect kill zone over the eastern defenses. Briggs had 2 men trying to suppress it, but their position was crap. They were only making the shooter duck, not taking him out of the fight. She stuffed Holloway's wound and cinched the tourniquet. Briggs, high ground, 210, you have no shot from there, his expression confirmed it. 400 meters, 2 hides, the left gunner is predictable, exposes his head. She was already repositioning for a better shot. Give me 60 seconds of cover. She got behind a pallet, found the gunner's nest in her scope, and adjusted for windage and range, a harder shot than from the ridge. The shooter had a pattern. Up for a 3 count, down for a 4. She observed him for 3 cycles. On the 4th, she sent the round. The left target dropped. She belly crawled 40 meters north to get an angle on the second gunner, who was already changing his position. Went prone, acquired him, fired. The enemy overwatch fell silent. 30 seconds later, she was back with Holloway. Briggs was still trying to register what she'd just done as she secured the tourniquet on the man's leg. His mind was full of noise, so he kept his mouth shut. She had already moved to the next man down. At 2240, Kowalski went down. He was on rear echelon detail, holding a line that had become the front. He had been holding his ground just fine until he wasn't. His body just quit on him, like a seized engine. She had been monitoring his respiration all day, a habit with all her post-surgical patients. His O2 saturation at 1600 hours was already borderline. His breathing was labored, which she'd incorrectly blamed on pain. It was a miscalculation, a diagnostic error she'd been trying to eliminate from her process. When his breathing pattern changed at 2240, the diagnosis was immediate. She was at his side in 6 seconds. Tension pneumothorax. The thin atmosphere and combat shock had sent him over the line. No air entry on the left side. His windpipe was shifting. A total respiratory failure. Kowalski, look at me. He couldn't speak. His skin had that ashen, bluish tint of a man drowning in his own chest. She produced a 14-gauge catheter, locating the insertion point by touch in the dark chaos. Second intercostal space. She drove it in with a single, decisive motion. If you hesitate with that needle, you're the one killing him. A rush of air escaped his chest. His color instantly returned. Her hand was unwavering on his ribs, timing his respirations, her voice steady. The catheter is in. You're breathing again. Easy breaths. He followed her command. She felt his vitals stabilize under her hand, while her tactical brain kept processing the battle. It was a mental state she had perfected over years. But then the cadence of the fight shattered. The rate of incoming fire from the west intensified. An enemy machine gunner had secured a superior position. She looked up from Kowalski. 70 meters away, Harwick was trapped in the open near a supply bunker. Repositioning the fire team had been the right call, but leading from the front has its price. The path he had taken was clear 60 seconds ago. Now, it was a fatal funnel. A hostile on the perimeter, 240 meters away, had Harwick zeroed and was squeezing the trigger. She knew she had 3 heartbeats. Releasing Kowalski, she ordered the man beside him, "Keep pressure on this wound. Don't let him move." She ran. Not to Harwick, but to a stack of crates 8 meters away. It gave her a clear line of sight. No time to go prone. She took a knee, weapon already in the pocket. Pulse hammering, no time to settle. She put the threat in the crosshairs and squeezed. 240 meters ceased to exist. Harwick's head whipped around, his gaze shifting from the neutralized enemy to her. She was already sprinting toward her casualty. Her hand returned to his chest, securing the seal and resuming the work the shot had interrupted. Her father's words echoed from a frigid November day when she was 20. On the range, she'd asked how he reconciled the man he was with the duty he performed. He paused for a long moment. Then, "You don't. There's no division. There are just your hands. They do their training. You're the sum of your actions. The talent is in knowing which hand to use, and having the will to do it." She checked Kowalski's pulse with one hand, her other scanning the defensive line. The understanding hit her, wordless and complete. She wasn't becoming him. She was becoming what he'd always envisioned for her. The message was simple: be better than me. Owengraf ordered the withdrawal at 23:14. At the time, Command didn't understand the real reason for the retreat. The official after-action report would list tactical failures, loss of key terrain, unsuccessful assaults, and the defenders' superior fire discipline. That was all true, but the grunts on the line knew the real story. They said the assault just fractured. A cold paralysis gripped the enemy, the kind of terror that comes from facing an opponent you can't comprehend. The enemy realized the firebase was nowhere near collapse. Each assault was met with a precise, rehearsed defense. Every probe that should have succeeded was instantly repelled. A strategic mind Graf hadn't accounted for was running the defense, and his men felt it. The base had an advantage his intelligence had completely missed. The assault force vanished into the night. Harwick had helicopters spooling up 4 minutes after they retreated. The position was packed and gone in 17 minutes. She was on the 3rd helo, a hand on 2 casualties, her calm voice grounding them. The mountains dissolved into a black emptiness. She focused on their vitals, shutting everything else out. That was the mission. Graf was captured 3 days later. Harwick made sure he was present for the intake. His request sailed through. He confronted a 51-year-old man who carried himself with the grim purpose of someone who'd survived 12 years in hell. Graf's hands were motionless, his face like stone. He looked at Harwick with the quiet acceptance of a man ready for the consequences. Harwick let the quiet stretch. "Syria, 2012, he said. Graf gave a slight nod. "Correct. And the result for your men? You've read the file. Tell me anyway." Graf met his gaze and began. For 40 minutes, he delivered a cold, factual debrief that left the room utterly still. Harwick stood his ground, offering no platitudes. An apology would have been meaningless. "This entry goes in your service record, backdated 12 years. I'm seeing it through." Graf's eyes lifted, a flicker of emotion breaking his composure. It was not forgiveness, merely acknowledgement. It was the expression of a man bearing an immense weight, who had just found someone who understood it. "That will suffice," Graf stated. Harwick's own AAR was 47 pages. He relayed that information to her like a tactical update. His report was an unvarnished assessment of her abilities. It listed the 22 trauma patients she treated in 2 nights, her critical interventions, and the tactical awareness behind her every decision. His conclusion was blunt. He also highlighted her unorthodox access, stating it produced results unattainable through standard channels. 4 days later, in a sun-drenched briefing room, he gave his final recommendation. A 2-star general wants a meeting. Thomas Caldwell. He's been in charge of a joint training command at NavSpec Warcom for 4 years. 3 years ago, he signed off on a black box instructional program, a pilot. A corner of Harwick's mouth twitched. He greenlit it, completely unaware of who wrote it. Her face was unreadable. He's requesting a meeting. Not an order. He wants to talk about the curriculum, about making it official. Harwick read her expression. He also said that if he'd known who the author was, he'd have approved it without a second thought. She considered that the enormous impact of scaling up, 4,000 operators, the potential scope of moving from a ghost program to official doctrine. She contrasted the quiet efficiency of the secret protocol with the immense power of an institutional one. "I'll take the meeting," she stated. Harwick nodded once, his eyes locking with hers. "My son is 22. He's in Bud S. I think about the skills he'll have when he finishes that pipeline. Then I think about the gaps in that training, the division we create between medicine and tactics, how we drill that separation into them." He let the silence sit. "Your program is what he needs, what all of them need." He stood. "I'm thankful you were on station." It was Dunar who informed the men. The news broke on the evening of the 5th day. The rec hall was filled with several hundred of the 480-man force. The rest packed the corridor, listening intently. Intel like that moves fast. Tessa was unavailable, buried in reports at the aid station. Dunar stood before the formation and gave them the unvarnished truth. He talked about Frank Cole, not his life, but the man's essential character. He detailed a legacy built over 30 years, his profound understanding of the mission and the successor he was mentoring. He described a daughter who inherited a legacy earned not by name, but by 1,000 pre-dawn mornings and a lifetime of unwavering focus. He spoke of a promise made on a dark night in a remote, forgotten valley. Then he dropped the bombshell about their instructor. He was direct, no fluff, the kind of straight talk they respected. The anonymous teacher from the last 3 years of their training, the voice that guided them through casualty evacuation drills, was the civilian doctor who had been with them all along. That composed, precise voice on the radio during the second night's engagement, directing forces as if she wrote the doctrine was hers. She did it all from behind a boulder, nursing a bullet wound in her own shoulder. An absolute silence descended on the room, the kind of tense quiet before a storm. In the 3rd row, Corporal Reed Kowalski had heard that instructor's voice 42 times in 3 years. He'd never connected a face to the call sign. The protocol demanded anonymity. Listening to the gunny, he replayed 42 lessons that had completely rewired his battlefield awareness. Memories flashed. A dry riverbed, a tourniquet applied in under 90 seconds, a needle decompression performed in total darkness, a steady hand on his chest calming his breathing. He rose to his feet, without a word. The man beside him stood. Then another. An energy coursed through the room of men, forged from the same metal. No order was given. Pure instinct took over. In the hall, men who only heard fragments of the news were also rising. Kowalski found her at the aid station. He had been walking for 2 days, his lungs slowly healing. He was weak, but mobile. He sat down opposite her as she worked on her reports, just watching. "I knew your voice," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "3rd training cycle," he explained. 2 years ago, September. The mass casualty exercise. An IED, a collapsed structure. You said triage for maximum effect, not for speed. The loudest casualty isn't always the priority. Save the greatest number you can. Don't fixate on one dramatic rescue. The statement hung there. I've thought about that lesson maybe 400 times. It changed my entire approach to the job. She put down her pen. "That's correct," she said. He nodded. "So why operate in secret?" he asked. She considered her answer. Because attaching my name to it would have created a bureaucratic turf war about a civilian contractor teaching tactics to spec ops. Her gaze met his. And that would make it about me, not the training. The training is all that matters. The doctrine needed to be judged on its own merits. He processed that. 314 classes, 3 years. About 14 men per class, he said, doing the mental arithmetic. That's over 4,000 operators trained on your system. He stopped. That's everyone here, and why we won. She looked up from her work. You need sleep, she told him. That lung is still healing. I know. He stood up. He locked eyes with her, his expression that of a man whose foundations had been shaken. Doc, he said from the doorway. She looked up. He gave a sharp nod. She returned it. The shoulder operation took 2 hours. The procedure was perfect, and the surgeon projected a full recovery. She emerged from the anesthetic clearly, as if rebooting as the drugs dissipated. Harwick was at her bedside. He looked up from his tablet. Surgery was a success. The surgeon gave me a full debrief. He slid the tablet away. Got a call from Admiral Caldwell while you were gone. The man's been pushing this joint training for 4 years. He greenlit the ghost op protocol on blind faith. Harwick met her gaze, said if he knew it was your baby, he'd have pushed it through with a blank check. His angle? To make this whole thing official. Real funding, full command support, a full service rollout. He's not trying to draft you. He wants to talk structure, figure out a new way forward with you, not just sign memos. Her eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles, she imagined 4,000 operators taking on a new combat doctrine like it was scripture. She recalculated Kowalski's numbers, feeling the immense weight of that many boots on the ground running a new system. She balanced the cover of staying a ghost against the power of going public, wondering if scale changed the equation. Set up the meeting, she stated. Harwick nodded once. A moment passed. My AAR is on file. It's all in there. Your actions are now etched in the official history, for good. She looked right at him. Good. Briggs appeared the day she was cleared for transport, in that early morning chaos when the post is already alive. He looked like a man moving on pure will, before doubt could catch up. He took a seat, his gaze dropped to his hands. When you got hit, he began, I ran my mouth. Just let me say this. She remained silent. I made a snap judgment on thin intel, less than 30 seconds. What I said? It was wrong. Dead wrong. He finally looked up. You were right. I was protecting my men, but I let a gut feeling become an absolute fact in my head. That ain't cover. It's a flaw, one that's cost me before. I should have known better. A heavy quiet. I'm sorry. She didn't look away. Accepted, she replied. He nodded once. Then I need a slot in the first course. Her brow furrowed. Course? Caldwell's program. The first cycle. His stare was intense. I'm 41, 12 years in the teams. And for 12 years, I treated medicine and combat as 2 different worlds, which means I've been doing it wrong for 12 years straight. I have to be in that class. She met his eyes for a long moment. You're on the roster, she said. He got to his feet. One last look. Your father, he said. For all his faults, he raised you right. Then he was gone. Half a year later, the weariness had finally left her face. The 9 pounds she'd shed between the op and the hospital had returned, her body at last downshifting from a war footing. Her left shoulder still sent a sharp reminder on cold days. A deep, nagging pain the surgeon said might be permanent. She treated it like a gear malfunction, not a weakness. Her morning started at 0530 with a 6-mile circuit, the Pacific Ocean to her left. The lights of Coronado sparkled in the sharp air below. Always the same route. Her father had taught her that routine isn't a cage. It's the structure that stands when the world falls apart. Post-run in Chow, she headed for the Integrated Combat Medicine Facility. The second cohort had just started, a fortnight after the first had completed. The first cycle had 16 students. This one had 22. 47 were on deck for the third. From the doorway, she saw them. 22 warriors, ages 22 to 44. with a shared lifetime spent in hell. Orders got them here, but the scuttlebutt is what filled the seats. The rumor mill said this program gives you a tool you don't recognize until it's the only one left. Reed Kowalski sat in the back. He submitted his request the minute he was cleared for duty, angling for the second class. He pulled no strings, landing his seat on merit like the 21 others. His gaze followed her in. They shared a slight nod. Third row, Colt Briggs was locked in with impeccable posture, his concentration total a student, not a critic. He looked like a man whose foundations had cracked, and he was carefully rebuilding, piece by piece. Behind her, at the head of the room, 11 words were on the whiteboard. She wrote them before the first cycle ever began, alone with memories of her father, the valley, and her own legacy. Not stenciled, not printed, just her hand, in marker that wouldn't erase a mantra that was never cleaned off. It wasn't in the official syllabus, it was the program's foundation. Heal when you can, fight when you must, know the difference. Her gaze swept the classroom. 22 men from different units, all with their own stories. Their common bond, they had all faced that critical decision, and they were here to sharpen that instinct. One November Tuesday, she phoned her mother, the ocean breeze drifting through her open window. The sound of the waves had been her only lullaby for half a year. Her mother, at 63, still lived in their old house, tending the garden her father had kept with platoon sergeant precision. When he passed, her mom took over the garden, describing it as the strangest part of her grief. It was how she held onto him, by continuing his mission. They talked for 40 minutes. She reported her shoulder was operational. It was the truth. Her mother inquired about the course. Tessa gave her the rundown on the second group. Varied pedigrees, singular purpose, and the deep reward of teaching something vital to men who would bet their lives on it. A quiet moment hung on the line. Then her mother spoke. I was petrified when I heard. Just terror, then anger, then back to terror. I know. I just wondered what your dad would have said. And that you understood the objective. A beat. That you were right where you needed to be. He's the one who taught me to read the ground, she said. That he did, her mother confirmed. I know. He told me himself. Her mother's tone lifted, as if a great weight was gone. He always saw the whole map, Tessa. This was on it. Damn right it was. Are you at peace with it now? Tessa looked out at the vast, black water. I believe so, she answered. For some time now. We just had to say it out loud. Good, her mom said. That's what matters. Later that night, she pulled out the letter. It had lived in her coat for 5 years and 3 months. She sat at her desk, the unopened envelope in her hand. There was no need to read it. The text was already committed to memory. The words had become part of her code, less an order and more the architecture of her beliefs. She felt the heft of the paper. His lesson came back. The difference between a promise and the principle it serves, the point where an operator has to find their own compass. Trust your instinct when the plan goes to hell. She did. She'd made the right call. She opened a drawer, set the letter dead center, and slid it shut. Not secreted away, not categorized, just put to rest. She no longer needed to bear its weight. The directive was now instinct. She had drilled its contents for 5 years until it was automatic. Monday morning, 0800. Pacific light flooded the room as she faced the class, the base a low thrum outside. 22 warriors were ready. 11 words were written in permanent marker on the board. Her mantra, her code. Last night's intel update. The third cycle had double the expected trainees. 2 other commands wanted to replicate the course. The Syria report was in the system, classified, but the facts of the operation were now recorded history. She sorted the raw data into tactical knowledge. Her eyes found Kowalski in the rear, his notebook out. He had the focused gaze of someone who understood these lessons came at a high price. Her focus moved to Briggs, third row, his posture flawless proof that discipline could rebuild a man from the ground up. She remembered her father and his 05 36-mile runs in San Diego. He knew that the missions that mattered most never made the reports, never got a medal, and were never spoken of. True legacy was the competence you build in others, the instinct that survives you. It isn't the rounds you send down range. It's the knowledge you impart. A flash of memory, the valley. A black peak, the envelope. The 2-second choice to defy a direct order for a higher purpose. The numbers were burned into her brain. 63 lost to save 477. She bore the cold arithmetic of leadership. Her mother's voice echoed. She imagined the letter settled in its drawer after 5 years of standing watch over her spirit. She knew what it meant to walk through hell. She saw them 22 men who'd made that same trip and were here to learn how to survive the return journey. She took a long, centering breath. "Okay, gentlemen," she began, her voice firm and clear. "Time to get to work." And the training commenced.